And your grandfather, who did not know either just which of them it was who told him that he must be a Negro, who could neither have heard yet nor recognized the term nigger, who even had no word for it in the tongue he knew, who had been born and grown up in a padded, silken vacuum cell, which might have been suspended on a cable 1,000 fathoms in the sea, where pigmentation had no more moral value than the silk walls and the scent and the rose-colored candle shades, where the very abstractions which he might have observed, monogamy and fidelity and decorum and gentleness and affection, were as purely rooted in the flesh's offices as the digestive processes. Your grandfather did not know if he was sent from the trundle bed at last, or if he quitted it by his own wish and will. If, when the time came, when his loneliness and grief became callous, he retired himself from Judith's bedroom, or was sent from it to sleep in the hall, where Clytie had likewise moved her pallet, though not on a pallet like her, but on a cot, elevated still, and perhaps not by Judith's decree either, but by the negress' fierce, inexorable, spurious humility. And then in the attic, the cot moved there. The few garments, the rags of the silk and broadcloth in which he had arrived, the harsh jeans and homespun which the two women bought and made for him, he accepting them with no thanks, no comment, accepting his garret room with no thanks, no comment, asking for and making no alteration in its Spartan arrangements that they knew of, until that second year when he was 14, and one of them, Clytie or Judith, found hidden beneath his mattress the shard of broken mirror. And who to know what hours of amazed and tearless grief he might have spent before it, examining himself in the delicate and outgrown tatters in which he perhaps could not even remember himself, with quiet and incredulous incomprehension, hanging behind a curtain contrived of a piece of old carpet nailed across a corner. And Clytie sleeping in the hall below, barring the foot of the attic stairs, guarding his escape or exit as inexorably as a Spanish dueña, teaching him to chop wood or to work the garden, and then to plow as his strength, his resiliency rather, since he would never be other than light in the bone and almost delicate, increased. The boy, with his light bones and womanish hands, struggling with what anonymous avatar of intractable mule, whatever tragic and barren clown was his bound fellow and complement beneath his first father's curse, getting the hang of it gradually, and the two of them, linked by the savage steel and wood male symbol, ripping from the prone rich female earth corn to feed them both, while Clytie watched, never out of sight of him, with that brooding, fierce, unflagging, jealous care, hurrying out whenever anyone white or black stopped in the road, as if to wait for the boy to complete the furrow and pause long enough to be spoken to, sending the boy on with a single quiet word or even gesture 100 times more fierce than the level murmur of vituperation with which she drove the passer-by on. So he, your grandfather, believed that it was neither of them. Not Clytie, who guarded him as if he were a Spanish virgin, who even before she could have even suspected that he would ever come there to live, had interrupted his first contact with a nigger and sent him back to the house. Not Judith, who could have refused at any time to let him sleep in that white child's bed in her room, who, even if she could not have reconciled herself to his sleeping on the floor, could have forced Clytie to take him into another bed with her, who would have made a monk, a celibate of him, perhaps, yet not a eunuch, who may not have permitted him to pass himself for a foreigner, yet who certainly would not have driven him to consort with Negroes. Your grandfather didn't know, even though he did know more than the town, the countryside knew, which was that there was a strange little boy living out there, who had apparently emerged from the house for the first time at the age of about 12 years, whose presence was not even unaccountable to the town and county, since they now believed they knew why Henry had shot Barn, and they wondered only where and how Clytie and Judith had managed to keep him concealed all the time, believing now that it had been a widow who had buried Barn, even though she had no paper to show for it, and only the incredulous and shocked speculation of your grandfather, though he had that $100 and the written directions in Judith's hand for this fourth tombstone in his safe at the time, had not yet associated the boy with the child he had seen 2 years ago when the octoroon came there to weep at the grave, to believe that the child might be Clytie's, got by its father on the body of his own daughter. A boy seen always near the house, with Clytie always nearby, then a youth learning to plow, and Clytie somewhere nearby, too, and it soon well known with what grim and unflagging alertness she discovered and interrupted any attempt to speak to him, and only your grandfather to couple at last the boy, the youth, with the child who had been there 3 or 4 years ago to visit that grave. Your grandfather, to whose office Judith came that afternoon 5 years later, and he could not remember when he had seen her in Jefferson before, the woman of 40 now in the same shapeless calico and faded sunbonnet, who would not even sit down, who, despite the impenetrable mask which she used for face, emanated a terrible urgency, who insisted that they walk on toward the courthouse while she talked, told him toward the crowded room where the justices' court sat, the crowded room which they entered, and your grandfather saw him, the boy, only a man now, handcuffed to an officer, his other arm in a sling and his head bandaged, since they had taken him to the doctor first. Your grandfather, gradually learning what had happened, or as much of it as he could, since the court itself couldn't get very much out of the witnesses, the ones who had fled and sent for the sheriff, the ones, excepting that one whom he had injured too badly to be present, with whom he had fought, a Negro ball held in a cabin a few miles from Sutpin's Hundred, and he there, present, and your grandfather never to know how often he had done this before, whether he had gone there to engage in the dancing or for the dice game in progress in the kitchen where the trouble started, trouble which he and not the Negroes started, according to the witnesses, and for no reason, no accusation of cheating, nothing, and he making no denial, saying nothing, refusing to speak at all, sitting there sullen, pale, and silent, so that at this point all truth, evidence, vanished into a moiling clump of Negro backs and heads and black arms and hands clutching sticks of stove wood and cooking implements and razors, the white man the focal point of it, and using a knife which he had produced from somewhere clumsily with obvious lack of skill and practice, yet with deadly earnestness and a strength which his slight build denied, a strength composed of sheer desperate will and imperviousness to the punishment, the blows and slashes which he took in return and did not even seem to feel. No cause, no reason for it, none to ever know exactly what happened, what curses and ejaculations which might have indicated what it was that drove him, and only your grandfather to fumble, grope, grasp the presence of that furious protest, that indictment of heaven's ordering, that gauge flung into the face of what is, with a furious and indomitable desperation which the demon himself might have shown, as if the child, and then the youth, had acquired it from the walls in which the demon had lived, the air which he had once walked in and breathed, until that moment when his own fate, which he had dared in his turn, struck back at him, only your grandfather to sense that because the justice and the others present did not recognize him, did not recognize this slight man with his bandaged head and arm, his sullen, impassive, and now bloodless olive face, who refused to answer any questions, make any statement, so that the justice, Jim Hamblett it was already making his speech of indictment when your grandfather entered, utilizing opportunity and audience to orate, his eyes already glazed with that cessation of vision of people who like to hear themselves talk in public. At this time, when our country is struggling to rise from beneath the iron heel of a tyrant oppressor, when the very future of the South as a place bearable for our women and children to live in depends on the labor of our own hands, when the tools which we have to use, to depend on, are the pride and integrity and forbearance of black men, and the pride and integrity and forbearance of white, that you, I say, a white man, a white, and your grandfather trying to reach him, stop him, trying to push through the crowd, saying, "Jim, Jim, Jim!" and it already too late, as if Hamblett's own voice had waked him at last, or if someone had snapped his fingers under his nose and waked him. He looked at the prisoner now, but saying "white" again, even while his voice died away, as if the order to stop the voice had been shocked into short circuit, and every face in the room turned toward the prisoner as Hamblett cried, "What are you? Who and where did you come from?" Your grandfather got him out, quashed the indictment and paid the fine, and brought him back to his office and talked to him while Judith waited in the anteroom. "You are Charles Bond's son," he said. "I don't know," the other answered, harsh and sullen. "You don't remember?" your grandfather said. The other did not answer. Then your grandfather told him he must go away, disappear, giving him money to go on. "Whatever you are, once you are among strangers, people who don't know you, you can be whatever you will. I will make it all right. I will talk to, what do you call her?" And he had gone too far now. But it was too late to stop. He sat there and looked at that still face which had no more expression than Judith's, nothing of hope nor pain, just sullen and inscrutable, and looking down at the calloused womanish hands with their cracked nails, which held the money, while your grandfather thought how he could not say Miss Judith, since that would postulate the blood more than ever. Then he thought, I don't even know whether he wants to hide it or not. So he said, "Miss Sutpin, I will tell Miss Sutpin not where you are going, of course, because I won't know that myself, but just that you are gone, and I knew you were going, and that you will be all right." So he departed, and your grandfather rode out to tell Judith, and Clytie came to the door and looked full and steadily at his face and said nothing, and went to call Judith, and your grandfather waited in that dim, shrouded parlor and knew that he would not have to tell either of them. He did not have to. Judith came presently and stood and looked at him and said, "I suppose you won't tell me?" "Not won't, can't," your grandfather said, "but not now because of any promise I made him. But he has money. He will be—" and stopped, with that forlorn little boy invisible between them, who had come there 8 years ago with the overall jumper over what remained of his silk and broadcloth, who had become the youth in the uniform, the tattered hat and the overalls of his ancient curse, who had become the young man with a young man's potence, yet was still that lonely child in his parchment and denim hair shirt, and your grandfather speaking the lame, vain words, the specious and empty fallacies which we call comfort, thinking, better that he were dead, better that he had never lived. Then thinking what vain and empty recapitulation that would be to her if he were to say it, who doubtless had already said it, thought it, changing only the person and the number. He returned to town, and now next time he was not sent for. He learned it as the town learned it, by that country grapevine whose source is among Negroes, and he, Charles Etienne St. Valery Barne, already returned, not home again, returned, before your grandfather learned how he had come back, appeared with a coal-black and ape-like woman, and an authentic wedding license, brought back by the woman since he had been so severely beaten and mauled recently that he could not even hold himself on the spavined and saddleless mule on which he rode, while his wife walked beside it to keep him from falling off. Rode up to the house and apparently flung the wedding license in Judith's face with something of that invincible despair with which he had attacked the Negroes in the dice game, and none ever to know what incredible tale lay behind that year's absence which he never referred to, and which the woman who, even a year later and after their son was born, still existed in that aghast and automaton-like state in which she had arrived, did not, possibly could not recount, but which she seemed to exude gradually and by a process of terrific and incredulous excretion, like the sweat of fear or anguish, how he had found her, dragged her out of whatever two-dimensional backwater, the very name of which, town or village, she either had never known, or the shock of her exodus from it had driven the name forever from her mind and memory. Her mentality had been capable of coercing food and shelter from, and married her, held her very hand, doubtless, while she made the laborious cross on the register, before she even knew his name or knew that he was not a white man, and this last none knew, even now, if she knew for certain, even after the son was born in one of the dilapidated slave cabins which he rebuilt after renting his parcel of land from Judith, how there followed something like a year composed of a succession of periods of utter immobility, like a broken cinema film, which the white-colored man who had married her spent on his back, recovering from the last mauling he had received, in frowsy, stinking rooms in places, towns, and cities, which likewise had no names to her, broken by other periods, intervals of furious and incomprehensible and apparently reasonless moving, progression, a maelstrom of faces and bodies through which the man thrust, dragging her behind him, toward or from what, driven by what fury which would not let him rest, she did not know, each one to end, finish, as the one before it had, so that it was almost a ritual, the man apparently hunting out situations in order to flaunt and fling the ape-like body of his charcoal companion in the faces of all and any who would retaliate. The Negro stevedores and deckhands on steamboats or in city honky-tonks who thought he was a white man and believed it only the more strongly when he denied it. The white men who, when he said he was a Negro, believed that he lied in order to save his skin, or worse, from sheer besotment of sexual perversion. In either case, the result the same, the man with body and limbs almost as light and delicate as a girl's, giving the first blow, usually unarmed and heedless of the numbers opposed to him, with that same fury and implacability and physical imperviousness to pain and punishment, neither cursing nor panting, but laughing. So he showed Judith the license, and took his wife, already far gone with the child, to the ruined cabin which he had chosen to repair, and installed her, kennelled her with a gesture, perhaps, and returned to the house. And nobody to know what transpired that evening between him and Judith, in whatever carpetless room, furnished with whatever chairs and such which they had not had to chop up and burn to cook food, or for warmth, or maybe to heat water for illness from time to time, the woman who had been widowed before she had been a bride, the son of the man who had bereaved her and a hereditary Negro concubine, who had not resented his black blood so much as he had denied the white, and this with a curious and outrageous exaggeration in which was inherent its own irrevocability, almost exactly as the demon himself might have done it. Because there was love, Miss Thompson said. There was that letter she brought and gave to your grandmother to keep. He, Quentin, could see it as plainly as he saw the one open upon the open textbook on the table before him, white in his father's dark hand against his linen leg in the September twilight, where the cigar smell, the wisteria smell, the fireflies drifted, thinking, "Yes, I have heard too much. I have been told too much. I have had to listen to too much, too long." Thinking, yes, almost exactly like father. That letter, and who to know what moral restoration she might have contemplated in the privacy of that house, that room, that night, what hurdling of iron old traditions, since she had seen almost everything else she had learned to call stable vanish like straws in a gale. She sitting there beside the lamp in a straight chair, erect, in the same calico, save that the sunbonnet would be missing now, the head bare now, the once coal-black hair streaked with gray now while he faced her, standing. He would not have sat. Perhaps she would not even have asked him to, and the cold, level voice would not be much louder than the sound of the lamp's flame. "I was wrong, I admit it. I believed that there were things which still mattered just because they had mattered once. But I was wrong. Nothing matters but breath, breathing, to know and to be alive. And the child, the license, the paper, what about it? That paper is between you and one who is inescapably Negro. It can be put aside. No one will any more dare bring it up than any other prank of a young man in his wild youth. And as for the child, all right. Didn't my own father beget one? And he none the worse for it. We will even keep the woman and the child, if you wish. They can stay here, and Clytie will—" Watching him, staring at him, yet not moving, immobile, erect, her hands folded motionless on her lap, hardly breathing, as if he were some wild bird or beast which might take flight at the expansion and contraction of her nostrils or the movement of her breast. "No, I will. I will raise it. See that it does not need to have any name. You will neither have to see it again nor to worry. We will have General Compson sell some of the land. He will do it, and you can go. Into the north, the cities, where it will not matter, even if— But they will not. They will not dare. I will tell them that you are Henry's son, and who could or would dare to dispute." And he standing there, looking at her, or not looking at her, she cannot tell, since his face would be lowered, the still expressionless, thin face, she watching him, not daring to move, her voice murmuring clear enough and full enough, yet hardly reaching him, "Charles," and he, "No, Miss Sutphen," and she again, still without moving, not stirring so much as a muscle, as if she stood on the outside of the thicket into which she had cajoled the animal which she knew was watching her, though she could not see it, not quite cringing, not in any terror or even alarm, but in that restive, light incorrigibility of the free, which would leave not even a print on the earth which lightly bore it, and she not daring to put out the hand with which she could have actually touched it, but instead just speaking to it, her voice soft and swooning, filled with that seduction, that celestial promise which is the female's weapon. "Call me Aunt Judith, Charles." Yes, who to know if he said anything or nothing? Turning, going out, she still sitting there, not moving, not stirring, watching him, still seeing him, penetrating walls and darkness, too, to watch him walk back down the weedy lane between the deserted, collapsed cabins, toward that one where his wife waited, treading the thorny and flint-paved path toward the Gethsemane which he had decreed and created for himself, where he had crucified himself and come down from his cross for a moment, and now returned to it. Not your grandfather. He knew only what the town, the county knew, that the strange little boy whom Clytie had used to watch and had taught to farm, who had sat a grown man in the justice's court that day, with his head bandaged and one arm in a sling and the other in a handcuff, who had vanished and then returned with an authentic wife resembling something in a zoo, now farmed on shares a portion of the Sutpin plantation, farmed it pretty well, with solitary and steady husbandry within his physical limitations, the body and limbs which still looked too light for the task which he had set himself, who lived like a hermit in the cabin which he rebuilt, and where his son was presently born, who consorted with neither white nor black. Clytie did not watch him now, she did not need to, and who was not seen in Jefferson but 3 times during the next 4 years, and then to appear, be reported by the negroes, who seemed to fear either him or Clytie or Judith, as being either blind or violently drunk in the Negro store district on Depot Street, where your grandfather would come and take him away, or if he were too drunk had become violent, the town officers, and keep him until his wife, the black gargoyle, could hitch the team back into the wagon and come with nothing alive about her but her eyes and hands, and load him into it and take him home. So they did not even miss him from town at first. It was the county medical officer who told your grandfather that he had yellow fever, and that Judith had had him moved into the big house and was nursing him, and now Judith had the disease, too, and your grandfather told him to notify Miss Coldfield, and he, your grandfather, rode out there one day. He did not dismount. He sat his horse and called until Clytie looked down at him from one of the upper windows and told him they didn't need nothing. Within the week, your grandfather learned that Clytie had been right, or was right now anyway, though it was Judith who died first. "Oh," Quentin said. Yes, he thought, too much, too long, remembering how he had looked at the 5th grave and thought how whoever had buried Judith must have been afraid that the other dead would contract the disease from her, since her grave was at the opposite side of the enclosure, as far from the other 4 as the enclosure would permit, thinking, Father won't have to say think this time, because he knew who had ordered and bought that headstone before he read the inscription on it, thinking about, imagining what careful printed directions Judith must have roused herself, from delirium possibly, to write down for Clytie when she knew that she was going to die, and how Clytie must have lived during the next 12 years while she raised the child which had been born in the old slave cabin, and scrimped and saved the money to finish paying out the stone on which Judith had paid his grandfather the $100 24 years ago, and which, when his grandfather tried to refuse it, she, Clytie, set the rusty can full of nickels and dimes and frayed paper money on the desk, and walked out of the office without a word. He had to brush the clinging cedar needles from this one also to read it, watching these letters also emerge beneath his hand, wondering quietly how they could have clung there, not have been blistered to ashes at the instant of contact with the harsh and unforgiving threat. Judith Coldfield Sutpin, daughter of Ellen Coldfield, born October 3, 1841, suffered the indignities and travails of this world for 42 years, 4 months, 9 days, and went to rest at last February 12, 1884. Pause. Mortal, remember vanity and folly, and beware. Thinking, Quentin, yes, I didn't need to ask who invented that, put that one up. Thinking, yes, to too much, too long. I didn't need to listen then, but I had to hear it, and now I am having to hear it all over again, because he sounds just like Father. Beautiful lives, women do. In very breathing they draw meat and drink from some beautiful attenuation of unreality, in which the shades and shapes of facts, of birth and bereavement, of suffering and bewilderment and despair, move with the substanceless decorum of lawn-party charades, perfect in gesture and without significance or any ability to hurt. Miss Rosa ordered that one. She decreed that headstone of Judge Benbow. He had been the executor of her father's estate, appointed by no will, since Mr. Coldfield left neither will nor estate, except the house and the rifled shell of the store. So he appointed himself, elected himself probably out of some conclave of neighbors and citizens who came together to discuss her affairs and what to do with her, after they realized that nothing under the sun, certainly no man nor committee of men, would ever persuade her to go back to her niece and brother-in-law. The same citizens and neighbors who left baskets of food on her doorstep at night. The dishes, the plates containing the food, the napkins which covered it, from which she never washed, but returned soiled to the empty basket, and set the basket back on the same step where she had found it, as if to carry completely out the illusion that it had never existed, or at least that she had never touched, emptied it, had not come out and taken the basket up with that air which had nothing whatever of furtiveness in it, nor even defiance, who doubtless tasted the food, criticized its quality or cooking, chewed and swallowed it and felt it digest, yet still clung to that delusion, that calm, incorrigible insistence, that that which all incontrovertible evidence tells her is so does not exist, as women can. That same self-deluding, which declined to admit that the liquidation of the store had left her something, that she had been left anything but a complete pauper, who would not accept the actual money from the sale of the store from Judge Benbow, yet would accept the money's value, and after a few years overvalue in a dozen ways, would use casual Negro boys who happened to pass the house, stopping them and commanding them to rake her yard, and they, doubtless as aware as the town was, that there would be no mention of pay from her, that they would not even see her again, though they knew she was watching them from behind the curtains of a window, but that Judge Benbow would pay them, would enter the stores and command objects from the shelves and showcases exactly as she commanded that $200 headstone from Judge Benbow, and walk out of the store with them, who, with the same aberrant cunning which would not wash the dishes and napkins from the baskets, declined to have any discussion of her affairs with Benbow, since she must have known that the sums which she had received from him must have years ago overbalanced. He, Benbow, had in his office a portfolio, a fat one, with Estate of Goodhue Coldfield, Private, written across it in indelible ink. After the judge died, his son Percy opened it. It was filled with racing forms and canceled betting tickets on horses whose very bones were no man knew where now, which had won and lost races on the Memphis track 40 years ago, and a ledger, a careful tabulation in the judge's hand, each entry indicating the date and the horse's name and his wager, and whether he won or lost, and another one showing how for 40 years he had put each winning and an amount equal to each loss to that mythical account, whatever the store had brought. But you were not listening, because you knew it all already, had learned, absorbed it already, without the medium of speech, somehow, from having been born and living beside it, with it, as children will and do, so that what your father was saying did not tell you anything so much as it struck, word by word, the resonant strings of remembering, who had been here before, seen these graves more than once in the rambling expeditions of boyhood, whose aim was more than the mere hunting of game, just as you had seen the old house, too, been familiar with how it would look before you even saw it, became large enough to go out there one day with 4 or 5 other boys of your size and age and dare one another to evoke the ghost, since it would have to be haunted, could not but be haunted, although it had stood there empty and unthreatening for 26 years, and nobody to meet or report any ghost until the wagon full of strangers moving from Arkansas tried to stop and spend the night in it, and something happened before they could begin to unload the wagon even. What, they did not or could not or would not tell, but which had them back in the wagon and the mules going back down the drive at a gallop all in about 10 minutes, not to stop until they reached Jefferson. The rotting shell with its sagging portico and scaling walls, its sagging blinds and blank-shuttered windows, set in the middle of the domain which had reverted to the state and had been bought and sold again and again and again. No, you were not listening. You didn't have to. Then the dogs stirred, rose. You looked up, and sure enough, just as your father had said he would, Luster had halted the mule and the 2 horses in the rain about 50 yards from the cedars, sitting there with his knees drawn up under the tow-sack and enclosed by the cloudy vapor of the steaming animals, as though he were looking at you and your father out of some lugubrious and painless purgatory. "Come on in out of the rain, Luster," your father said. "I won't let the old colonel hurt you." "Y'all come on and let's go home," Luster said. "Ain't no more hunting today." "We'll get wet," your father said. "I'll tell you what, we'll ride on over to that old house. We can keep good and dry there." But Luster didn't budge, sitting there in the rain and inventing reasons not to go to the house, that the roof would leak, or that you would all 3 catch cold with no fire, or that you would all get so wet before you reached it that the best thing to do would be to go straight home. And your father laughing at Luster, but you not laughing so much, because even though you were not black like Luster was, you were not any older, and you and Luster had both been there that day when the 5 of you, the 5 boys all of an age, began daring one another to enter the house long before you reached it, coming up from the rear into the old street of the slave quarters, a jungle of sumac and persimmon and briars and honeysuckle, and the rotting piles of what had once been log walls and stone chimneys and shingle roofs among the undergrowth, except one, that one, you coming up to it. You didn't see the old woman at all at first because you were watching the boy, the Jim Bond, the hulking, slack-mouthed, saddle-colored boy, a few years older and bigger than you were, in patched and faded yet quite clean shirt and overalls, too small for him, working in the garden patch beside the cabin, so you didn't even know she was there until all of you started and whirled as one, and found her watching you from a chair tilted back against the cabin wall, a little dried-up woman, not much bigger than a monkey, who might have been any age up to 10,000 years, in faded, voluminous skirts and an immaculate head-rag, her bare, coffee-colored feet wrapped around the chair rung like monkeys do, smoking a clay pipe and watching you with eyes like 2 shoe buttons buried in the myriad wrinkles of her coffee-colored face, who just looked at you and said, without even removing the pipe, and in a voice almost like a white woman's, "What do you want?" And after a moment one of you said, "Nothing," and then you were all running without knowing which of you began to run first, nor why, since you were not scared, back across the fallow and rain-gutted and briar-choked old fields, until you came to the old rotting snake fence and crossed it, hurled yourselves over it, and then the earth, the land, the sky, and trees and woods looked different again, all right again. "Yes," Quentin said. "And that was the one Luster was talking about now?" Shreve said. "And your father watching you again because you hadn't heard the name before? Hadn't even thought that he must have a name that day when you saw him in the vegetable patch, and you said, 'Who? Jim what?' And Luster said, "Das him, bright-colored boy, what stay with the old woman. And your father still watching you, and you said, 'Spell it.' And Lester said, 'That's a lawyer word. What they puts you under when the law catches you. I dis spells reading words.' And that was him, the name Bond now, and he wouldn't care about that, who had inherited what he was from his mother, and only what he could never have been from his father. And if your father had asked him if he was Charles Bond's son, he not only would not have known either, he wouldn't have cared. And if you had told him he was, it would have touched and then vanished from what you, not he, would have had to call his mind, long before it could have set up any reaction at all, either of pride or pleasure, anger or grief." "Yes," Quentin said. "And that he lived in that cabin behind the haunted house for 26 years, he and the old woman, who must be more than 70 now, yet who had no white hair under that head rag, whose flesh had not sagged, but looked instead like she had grown old up to a certain point, just like normal people do, then had stopped, and instead of turning gray and soft, she had begun to shrink, so that the skin of her face and hands broke into a million tiny crosshair wrinkles, and her body just grew smaller and smaller, like something being shrunk in a furnace, like the Bornese do their captured heads, who might well have been the ghost if one was ever needed, if anyone ever had so little to do as to prowl around the house, which there was not, if there could have been anything in it to protect from prowlers, which there was not, if there had been any one of them left to hide or need concealment in it, which there was not. And yet this old gal, this Aunt Rosa, told you that someone was hiding out there, and you said it was Clytie or Jim Bond, and she said no, and you said it would have to be because the demon was dead, and Judith was dead, and Bond was dead, and Henry gone so far he hadn't even left the grave. And she said no. And so you went out there, drove the 12 miles at night in a buggy, and you found Clytie and Jim Bond both in it, and you said, 'You see?' And she, the Aunt Rosa, still said no, and so you went on, and there was?" "Yes." "Wait, then," Shreve said. "For God's sake, wait." Chapter 7. There was no snow on Shreve's arm now, no sleeve on his arm at all now, only the smooth, cupid-fleshed forearm and hand coming back into the lamp and taking a pipe from the empty coffee can where he kept them, filling it and lighting it. So it is 0 outside, Quentin thought. Soon he will raise the window and do deep breathing in it, clench-fisted and naked to the waist, in the warm and rosy orifice above the iron quad. But he had not done so yet, and now the moment, the thought, was an hour past, and the pipe lay smoked out and overturned and cold, with a light sprinkling of ashes about it, while he watched Quentin from behind the 2 opaque and lamp-glared moons of his spectacles. "So he just wanted a grandson," he said. "That was all he was after. Jesus, the South is fine, isn't it? It's better than the theater, isn't it? It's better than Ben-Hur, isn't it? No wonder you have to come away now and then, isn't it?" Quentin did not answer. He sat quite still, facing the table, his hands lying on either side of the open textbook on which the letter rested, the rectangle of paper folded across the middle and now open, 3/4 open, whose bulk had raised half itself by the leverage of the old crease in weightless and paradoxical levitation, lying at such an angle that he could not possibly have read it, deciphered it, even without this added distortion. Yet he seemed to be looking at it, or as near as Shreve could tell he was, his face lowered a little, brooding, almost sullen. "He told Grandfather about it," he said, "that time when the architect escaped, tried to escape into the river bottom and go back to New Orleans or wherever it was, and he—" "The demon, hey?" Shreve said. Quentin did not answer him, did not pause. his voice level, curious, a little dreamy, yet still with that overtone of sullen bemusement, of smoldering outrage, so that Shreve, still too, resembling in his spectacles and nothing else, from the waist down the table concealed him, anyone entering the room would have taken him to be stark naked, a Baroque effigy created out of colored cake dough by someone with a faintly nightmarish affinity for the perverse, watched him with thoughtful and intent curiosity, sent word in to Grandfather and some others, and got his dogs and his wild niggers out and hunted the architect down and made him take earth in a cave under the river bank 2 days later. That was in the second summer, when they had finished all the brick and had the foundations laid and most of the big timbers cut and trimmed, and one day the architect couldn't stand it any more, or he was afraid he would starve, or that the wild niggers, and maybe Colonel Sutphen too, would run out of grub and eat him. Or maybe he got homesick, or maybe he just had to go. Maybe he had a girl, Shreve said, or maybe he just wanted a girl. You said the demon and the niggers didn't have but 2. Quentin did not answer this either. Again, he might not have heard, talking in that curious, repressed, calm voice, as though to the table before him, or the book upon it, or the letter upon the book, or his hands lying on either side of the book. And so he went. He seemed to vanish in broad daylight, right out from the middle of 21 people. Or maybe it was just Sutphen's back that was turned, and that the niggers saw him go and didn't think it needed mentioning. That being wild men, they probably didn't know what Sutphen himself was up to, and him naked in the mud with them all day. So I reckon they never did know what the architect was there for, supposed to do, or had done, or could do, or was. So maybe they thought Sutphen had sent him, told him to go away and drown himself, go away and die, or maybe just go away. So he did. Jumped up in broad daylight, in his embroidered vest and Fauntleroy tie and a hat like a Baptist congressman, and probably carrying the hat in his hand, and ran into the swamp, and the niggers watched him out of sight and then went back to work, and Sutphen didn't see it. Didn't even miss him until night, supper time probably, and the niggers told him, and he declared a holiday tomorrow because he would have to get out and borrow some dogs. Not that he would have needed dogs with his niggers to trail, but maybe he thought that the guests, the others, would not be used to trailing with niggers and would expect dogs. And Grandfather, he was young then too, brought some champagne, and some of the others brought whiskey. And they began to gather out there a little after sundown at his house that didn't even have walls yet, that wasn't anything yet but some lines of bricks sunk into the ground. But that was all right, because they didn't go to bed anyhow, Grandfather said. They just sat around the fire with the champagne and the whiskey and a quarter of the last venison he had killed. And about midnight the man with the dogs came. Then it was daylight, and the dogs had a little trouble at first, because some of the wild niggers had run out about a mile of the trail just for fun. But they got the trail straightened out at last, the dogs and the niggers in the bottom, and most of the men riding along the edge of it, where the going was good. But Grandfather and Colonel Sutphen went with the dogs and the niggers, because Sutphen was afraid the niggers might catch the architect before he could reach them. He and Grandfather had to walk a good deal, sending one of the niggers to lead the horses on around the bad places until they could ride again. Grandfather said it was fine weather, and the trail lay pretty good, but he said it would have been fine if the architect had just waited until October or November. And so he told Grandfather something about it. His trouble was innocence. All of a sudden he discovered not what he wanted to do, but what he just had to do. Had to do whether he wanted to or not, because if he did not do it, he knew that he could never live with himself for the rest of his life. Never live with what all the men and women that had died to make him had left inside of him for him to pass on, with all the dead ones waiting and watching to see if he was going to do it right, fix things right, so that he would be able to look in the face not only the old dead ones, but all the living ones that would come after him, when he would be one of the dead. and that at the very moment when he discovered what it was, he found out that this was the last thing in the world he was equipped to do, because he not only had not known that he would have to do this, he did not even know that it existed to be wanted, to need to be done, until he was almost 14 years old, because he was born in West Virginia, in the mountains, where— "Not in West Virginia," Shreve said. "What?" Quentin said. "Not in West Virginia," Shreve said, "because if he was 25 years old in Mississippi in 1833, he was born in 1808, and there wasn't any West Virginia in 1808 because—" "All right," Quentin said. "West Virginia wasn't admitted." All right, Quentin said, "into the United States until—" All right, Quentin said. "Where what few other people he knew lived in log cabins boiling with children like the one he was born in. Men and grown boys who hunted or lay before the fire on the floor while the women and older girls stepped back and forth across them to reach the fire to cook. Where the only colored people were Indians, and you only looked down at them over your rifle sights. Where he had never even heard of, never imagined a place, a land divided neatly up and actually owned by men who did nothing but ride over it on fine horses, or sit in fine clothes on the galleries of big houses, while other people worked for them. He did not even imagine then that there was any such way to live, or to want to live, or that there existed all the objects to be wanted which there were, or that the ones who owned the objects not only could look down on the ones that didn't, but could be supported in the down-looking, not only by the others who owned objects too, but by the very ones that were looked down on, that didn't own objects, and knew they never would. Because where he lived, the land belonged to anybody and everybody, and so the man who would go to the trouble and work to fence off a piece of it and say, 'This is mine,' was crazy. And as for objects, nobody had any more of them than you did, because everybody had just what he was strong enough or energetic enough to take and keep. And only that crazy man would go to the trouble to take or even want more than he could eat or swap for powder and whiskey. So he didn't even know there was a country all divided and fixed and neat, with the people living on it all divided and fixed and neat because of what color their skins happened to be and what they happened to own, and where a certain few men not only had the power of life and death and barter and sale over others, they had living human men to perform the endless repetitive personal offices, such as pouring the very whiskey from the jug and putting the glass into his hand, or pulling off his boots for him to go to bed, that all men have had to do for themselves since time began, and would have to do until they died, and which no man ever has or ever will like to do, but which no man that he knew had ever any more thought of evading than he had thought of evading the effort of chewing and swallowing and breathing. When he was a child, he didn't listen to the vague and cloudy tales of tidewater splendor that penetrated even his mountains, because then he could not understand what the people meant. And when he became a boy, he didn't listen to them, because there was nothing in sight to compare and gauge the tales by, and so give the words life and meaning, and no chance that he ever would, certainly no belief or thought that someday he might, and because he was too busy doing the things that boys do, and when he got to be a youth and curiosity itself exhumed the tales, which he did not know he had heard, and speculated about them, he was interested and would have liked to see the places once, but without envy or regret, because he just thought that some people were spawned in one place and some in another, some spawned rich, lucky, he may have called it, or maybe he called lucky rich, and some not, and that, so he told Grandfather, the men themselves had little to do with the choosing and less of the regret, because he told Grandfather this too, it had never once occurred to him that any man should take any such blind accident as that as authority or warrant to look down at others, any others. So he had hardly heard of such a world until he fell into it. That's how it was. They fell into it. The whole family returned to the coast from which the first Sutphin had come, when the ship from the Old Bailey reached Jamestown probably, tumbled head over heels back to tidewater by sheer altitude, elevation, and gravity, as if whatever slight hold the family had had— he said something to Grandfather about his mother dying about that time, and how his pap said she was a fine, wearying woman, and that he would miss her, and something about how it was the wife that had got his father even that far west, on the mountain, had broken. And now the whole passel of them, from the father through the grown daughters, down to one that couldn't even walk yet, sliding back down out of the mountains and skating in a kind of accelerating and sloven and inert coherence, like a useless collection of flotsam on a flooded river, moving by some perverse automotivation, such as inanimate objects sometimes show, backward against the very current of the streams, across the Virginia plateau, and into the slack lowlands about the mouth of the James River. He didn't know why they moved, or didn't remember the reason if he ever knew it, whether it was optimism, hope in his father's breast, or nostalgia, since he didn't know just where his father had come from, whether the country to which they returned was it or not, or even if his father knew, remembered, wanted to remember, and find it again, whether somebody, some traveler, had told him of some easy place or time, some escape from the hardship of getting food and keeping warm in the mountain way, or if perhaps somebody his father knew once, or who knew his father once and remembered him, happened to think about him, or someone kin to him who had tried to forget him and couldn't quite do it, had sent for him, and he obeying, going not for the promised job, but for the ease, having faith, perhaps, in the blood kinship to evade the labor, if it was kinship, in his own inertia, and in whatever gods had watched over him this far, if it were not. But he, the demon, Shreve said, didn't know or remember whether he had ever heard, been told the reason or not. All he remembered was that one morning the father rose and told the older girls to pack what food they had, and somebody wrapped up the baby and somebody else threw water on the fire, and they walked down the mountain to where roads existed. They had a lopsided, two-wheeled cart and two spavined oxen now. He told Grandfather he did not remember just where, nor when, nor how his father had got it, and he was 10 then. The two older boys had left home some time before and had not been heard of since, driving the oxen, since almost as soon as they got the cart, his father began the practice of accomplishing that part of the translation devoted to motion flat on his back in the cart, oblivious among the quilts and lanterns and well buckets and bundles of clothing and children, snoring with alcohol. That was how he told it. He didn't remember if it was weeks or months or a year they traveled, except that one of the older girls who had left the cabin unmarried was still unmarried when they finally stopped, though she had become a mother before they lost the last Blue Mountain Range. Whether it was that winter and then spring and then summer overtook and passed them on the road, or whether they overtook and passed in slow succession the seasons as they descended, or whether it was the descent itself that did it, and they not progressing parallel in time, but descending perpendicularly through temperature and climate. You couldn't call it a period, because as he remembered it, or as he told Grandfather he did, it didn't have either a definite beginning or a definite ending. Maybe attenuation is better. An attenuation from a kind of furious inertness and patient immobility while they sat in the cart outside the doors of doggeries and taverns and waited for the father to drink himself insensible, to a sort of dreamy and destinationless locomotion after they had got the old man out of whatever shed or outhouse or barn or ditch and loaded him into the cart again, and during which they did not seem to progress at all, but just to hang suspended while the earth itself altered, flattened and broadened out of the mountain cove where they had all been born, mounting, rising about them like a tide in which the strange, harsh, rough faces about the doggery doors into which the old man was just entering, or was just being carried or thrown out, and this one time by a huge bull of a nigger, the first black man, slave, they had ever seen, who emerged with the old man over his shoulder like a sack of meal, and the nigger's mouth, loud with laughing and full of teeth, like tombstones, swam up and vanished and were replaced. The earth, the world, rising about them and flowing past, as if the cart moved on a treadmill, and it now spring and now summer, and they still moving on toward a place they had never seen and had no conception of, let alone wanted to go to, and from a place, a little lost spot on the side of a hill, back to which probably not one of them, excepting possibly the usually insensible father, who made one stage of the journey accompanied by the raspberry-colored elephants and snakes which he seems to have been hunting for, could have led the way, bringing into and then removing from their sober, static country astonishment the strange faces and places, both faces and places, doggeries and taverns now become hamlets, hamlets now become villages, villages now town, and the country flattened out now with good roads and fields, and niggers working in the fields, while white men sat fine horses and watched them, and more fine horses and men in fine clothes with a different look in the face from mountain men about the taverns where the old man was not even allowed to come in by the front door, and from which his mountain drinking manners got him ejected before he would have time to get drunk good. So that now they began to make really pretty good time, and no laughter and jeers to the ejecting now, even if the laughter and jeers had been harsh, and without much gentleness in them. That's the way he got it. He had learned the difference not only between white men and black ones, but he was learning that there was a difference between white men and white men, not to be measured by lifting anvils, or gouging eyes, or how much whiskey you could drink, then get up and walk out of the room. That is, he had begun to discern that without being aware of it yet. He still thought that that was just a matter of where you were spawned and how, lucky or not lucky, and that the lucky ones would be even slower and loather than the unlucky to take advantage of it or credit for it, feel that it gave them anything more than the luck, that they would feel, if anything, more tender toward the unlucky than the unlucky would ever need to feel toward them. He was to find all that out later. He remembered when he did it, because that was the same second when he discovered the innocence. It was not the second, the moment, that he was long about. It was the getting to it, the moment when they must have realized, believed at last, that they were no longer traveling, moving, going somewhere, not the being still at last, and in a fashion settled, because they had done that before on the road. He remembered how one time the gradual difference in comfort between the presence and absence of shoes and warm clothing occurred in one place, a cowshed where the sister's baby was born, and, as he told grandfather, for all he could remember, locate in elapsed time, conceived, too, because they were stopped now at last. He didn't know where they were. For a time, during the first days or weeks or months, the woodsman's instinct, which he had acquired from the environment where he grew up, or maybe had been bequeathed him by the two brothers who had vanished, one of which had been as far west as the Mississippi River one time, bequeathed him along with the worn-out buckskin garments and such, which they left in the cabin when they departed the last time for good, and which he had sharpened by boys' practice at small game and such, kept him oriented so that he could have, so he said, found his way back to the mountain cabin in time. But that was past now. The moment when he last could have said exactly where he had been born now, weeks and months, maybe a year, the year, since that was when he became confused about his age and was never able to straighten it out again, so that he told grandfather that he did not know within a year on either side just how old he was, behind him, so he knew neither where he had come from, nor where he was, nor why. He was just there, surrounded by the faces, almost all the faces which he had ever known, always known, though the number of them, despite the efforts of the unmarried sister who pretty soon, so he told Grandfather, and still without any wedding, had another baby, decreasing, thinning out because of the climate, the warmth, the dampness, living in a cabin that was almost a replica of the mountain one, except that it didn't sit up in the bright wind, but sat instead beside a big flat river that sometimes showed no current at all, or even sometimes ran backward, where his sisters and brothers seemed to take sick after supper and die before the next meal, where regiments of niggers, with white men watching them, planted and raised things that he had never heard of. The old man did something, too, something besides drink now. At least he would leave the cabin after breakfast and return sober to supper, and he fed them somehow. And the man who owned all the land and the niggers, and apparently the white men who superintended the work, lived in the biggest house he had ever seen, and spent most of the afternoon. He told how he would creep up among the tangled shrubbery of the lawn and lie hidden and watch the man in a barrel-stave hammock between two trees with his shoes off, and a nigger who wore every day better clothes than he or his father and sisters had ever owned, and ever expected to, who did nothing else but fan him and bring him drinks. And he was 11 or 12 or 13 now, because this was where he realized that he had irrevocably lost count of his age, lying there all afternoon while the sisters would come from time to time to the door of the cabin 2 miles away and scream at him for wood or water, watching that man who not only had shoes in the summertime, too, but didn't even have to wear them. But he still didn't envy the man he was watching. He coveted the shoes, and probably he would have liked for his father to have a broadcloth monkey to hand him the jug and to carry the wood and water into the cabin for his sisters to wash and cook with and keep the house warm, so that he himself would not have to do it. Maybe he even understood the pleasure it would have given his sisters for their neighbors, other whites like them who lived in other cabins not quite as well built and not at all as well kept and preserved as the ones the nigger slaves lived in, but still nimbused with freedom's bright aura, which the slave quarters were not, for all their sound roofs and whitewash, to see them being waited on, because he had not only not lost the innocence yet, he had not yet discovered that he possessed it. He no more envied the man than he would have envied a mountain man who happened to own a fine rifle. He would have coveted the rifle, but he would himself have supported and confirmed the owner's pride and pleasure in its ownership, because he could not have conceived of the owner taking such crass advantage of the luck which gave the rifle to him, rather than to another, as to say to other men, "Because I own this rifle, my arms and legs and blood and bones are superior to yours," except as the victorious outcome of a fight with rifles. And how in the world could a man fight another man with dressed-up niggers, and the fact that he could lie in a hammock all afternoon with his shoes off? And what in the world would he be fighting for if he did? He didn't even know he was innocent that day when his father sent him to the big house with the message. He didn't remember, or did not say, what the message was. Apparently, he still didn't know exactly just what his father did, what work, or maybe supposed to do, the old man had in relation to the plantation. A boy either 13 or 14, he didn't know which, in garments his father had got from the plantation commissary and had worn out, and which one of the sisters had patched and cut down to fit him, and he no more conscious of his appearance in them, or of the possibility that anyone else would be than he was of his skin, following the road and turning into the gate and following the drive up past where still more niggers with nothing to do all day but plant flowers and trim grass were working, and so to the house, the portico, the front door, thinking how at last he was going to see the inside of it, See what else a man was bound to own who could have a special nigger to hand him his liquor and pull off his shoes that he didn't even need to wear, never for one moment thinking but what the man would be as pleased to show him the balance of his things as the mountain man would have been to show the powder horn and bullet mold that went with the rifle, because he was still innocent. He knew it without being aware that he did. He told Grandfather how, before the monkey nigger who came to the door had finished saying what he did, he seemed to kind of dissolve, and a part of him turn and rush back through the 2 years they had lived there, like when you pass through a room fast and look at all the objects in it, and you turn and go back through the room again and look at all the objects from the other side, and you find out you had never seen them before. Rushing back through those 2 years and seeing a dozen things that had happened, and he hadn't even seen them before. A certain flat, level, silent way his older sisters and the other white women of their kind had of looking at niggers, not with fear or dread, but with a kind of speculative antagonism, not because of any known fact or reason, but inherited by both white and black. The sense, effluvium of it, passing between the white women in the doors of the sagging cabins and the niggers in the road, and which was not quite explainable by the fact that the niggers had better clothes, and which the niggers did not return as antagonism or in any sense of dare or taunt, but through the very fact that they were apparently oblivious of it, too oblivious of it. You knew that you could hit them, he told Grandfather, and they would not hit back or even resist, but you did not want to, because they, the niggers, were not it, not what you wanted to hit, that when you hit them, you would just be hitting a child's toy balloon with a face painted on it, a face slick and smooth and distended and about to burst into laughing. And so you did not dare strike it because it would merely burst, and you would rather let it walk on out of your sight than to have stood there in the loud laughing of talk at night before the fire when they had company, or had themselves gone visiting after supper to another cabin. The voices of the women sober enough, even calm, yet filled with a quality dark and sullen, and only some man, usually his father, in drink, to break out into harsh recapitulation of his own worth, the respect which his own physical prowess commanded from his fellows, and the boy of either 13 or 14 or maybe 12, knowing that the men and the women were talking about the same thing, though it had never once been mentioned by name, like when people talk about privation without mentioning the siege, about sickness without ever naming the epidemic. Of one afternoon, when he and his sister were walking along the road, and he heard the carriage coming up behind them and stepped off the road and then realized that his sister was not going to give way to it, that she still walked in the middle of the road with a sort of sullen implacability in the very angle of her head, and he shouted at her, and then it was all dust and rearing horses and glinting harness buckles and wheel spokes. He saw 2 parasols in the carriage, and the nigger coachman in a plug hat shouting, "Who dar, gal? Get out and away dar!" And then it was over, gone, the carriage and the dust, the 2 faces beneath the parasols glaring down at his sister. Then he was throwing vain clods of dirt after the dust as it spun on, knowing now, while the monkey-dressed nigger butler kept the door barred with his body while he spoke, that it had not been the nigger coachman that he threw at all, that it was the actual dust raised by the proud, delicate wheels, and just that vain. Of one night late when his father came home, blundered into the cabin, he could smell the whiskey even while still dulled with broken sleep, hearing that same fierce exultation, vindication, in his father's voice. "We whooped one of Pettibone's niggers tonight." And he roused at that, waked at that, asking which one of Pettibone's niggers, and his father said he did not know. He never seen the nigger before. And he asked what the nigger had done, and his father said, "Hellfire, that goddamn son of a bitch Pettibone's nigger." How, without knowing it then, since he had not yet discovered innocence, he must have meant the question the same way his father meant the answer. No actual nigger, living creature, living flesh to feel pain and writhe and cry out. He could even seem to see them, the torch-disturbed darkness among trees, the fierce, hysterical faces of the white men, the balloon face of the nigger. Maybe the nigger's hands would be tied or held, but that would be all right, because they were not the hands with which the balloon face would struggle and writhe for freedom, not the balloon face. It was just poised among them, levitative and slick with paper-thin distension. Then someone would strike the balloon, one single desperate and despairing blow, and then he would seem to see them, fleeing, running, with all about them, overtaking them and passing and going on and then returning to overwhelm them again, the roaring waves of mellow laughter, meaningless and terrifying and loud. And now he stood there before that white door with the monkey nigger barring it, and looking down at him in his patched, made-over jean clothes and no shoes, and I don't reckon he even ever experimented with a comb, because that would be one of the things that his sisters would keep hidden good, who had never thought about his own hair or clothes or anybody else's hair or clothes until he saw that monkey nigger, who, through no doing of his own, happened to have had the felicity of being housebred in Richmond, maybe, looking, or maybe even in Charleston, Shreve breathed, at them, and he never even remembered what the nigger said, how it was the nigger told him, even before he had had time to say what he came for, never to come to that front door again, but to go around to the back. He didn't even remember leaving. All of a sudden he found himself running, and already some distance from the house, and not toward home. He was not crying, he said. He wasn't even mad. He just had to think. So he was going to where he could be quiet and think, and he knew where that place was. He went into the woods. He says he did not tell himself where to go, that his body, his feet, just went there, a place where a game trail entered a canebrake, and an oak tree had fallen across it, and made a kind of cave where he kept an iron griddle that he would cook small game on sometimes. He said he crawled back into the cave and sat with his back against the uptorn roots and thought, because he couldn't get it straight yet. He couldn't even realize yet that his trouble, his impediment, was innocence, because he would not be able to realize that until he got it straight. So he was seeking among what little he had to call experience for something to measure it by, and he couldn't find anything. He had been told to go around to the back door even before he could state his errand, who had sprung from a people whose houses didn't have back doors, but only windows, and anyone entering or leaving by a window would be either hiding or escaping, neither of which he was doing. In fact, he had actually come on business, in the good faith of business, which he had believed that all men accepted. Of course, he had not expected to be invited in to eat a meal, since time, the distance from one cooking pot to the next, did not need to be measured in hours or days. Perhaps he had not expected to be asked into the house at all, but he did expect to be listened to, because he had been sent on some business, which, even though he didn't remember what it was, and maybe at the time, he said, he might not even have comprehended, was certainly connected somehow with the plantation that supported and endured that smooth white house, and that smooth white brass-decorated door, and the very broadcloth and linen and silk stockings the monkey nigger stood in to tell him to go around to the back before he could even state the business. It was like he might have been sent with a lump of lead or even a few molded bullets, so that the man who owned the fine rifle could shoot it, and the man came to the door and told him to leave the bullets on a stump at the edge of the woods, not even letting him come close enough to look at the rifle. Because he was not mad. He insisted on that to Grandfather. He was just thinking, because he knew that something would have to be done about it. He would have to do something about it in order to live with himself for the rest of his life, and he could not decide what it was because of that innocence which he had just discovered he had, which, the innocence, not the man, the tradition, he would have to compete with. He had nothing to compare and gauge it by but the rifle analogy, and it would not make sense by that. He was quite calm about it, he said, sitting there with his arms around his knees in his little den beside the game trail, where more than once, when the wind was right, he had seen deer pass within 10 feet of him, arguing with himself quietly and calmly, while both debaters agreed that if there were only someone else, some older and smarter person to ask. But there was not. There was only himself. The two of them inside that one body, which was maybe 13, or maybe 14, or maybe was already 15, but would never know it for certain forevermore, arguing quiet and calm. "But I can shoot him!" Not the monkey nigger. It was not the nigger any more than it had been the nigger that his father had helped to whip that night. The nigger was just another balloon face, slick and distended with that mellow, loud, and terrible laughing, so that he did not dare to burst it, looking down at him from within the half-closed door during that instant in which, before he knew it, something in him had escaped, and he, unable to close the eyes of it, was looking out from within the balloon face just as the man who did not even have to wear the shoes he owned, whom the laughter which the balloon held barricaded and protected from such as he, looked out from whatever invisible place he, the man, happened to be at the moment, at the boy outside the barred door in his patched garments and splayed bare feet, looking through and beyond the boy